Conflict resolution expert Dr Kingsley Makhubela joins us now for more on this. A very good evening to you, Dr Makhubela. Thank you so much for speaking to us. So South Africa's foreign minister, as you saw, they're deflecting criticism on the joint military drills planned with Russia and China, saying that hosting such exercises with friends is a natural course of relations. But the question is, why should South Africa have to defend this decision?
Good evening, Tsepiso, and it's always a pleasure really to talk to you. I don't know why people are making a fuss out of the military drills that are going to happen. And these drills are basically confined to the navies of the three countries. You recall sometimes in October last year, there were military drills between South African Defense Force and the US component. And there was no hula-baloo around these issues. We are having these military drills with China and Russia because we have a huge maritime border that we think the capability and the capacity of coordinate with other navies is so essential for our own protection and for the management of our maritime borders. So I really don't see why people are starting to question South Africa. South Africa has to explain this. Military drills are happening amongst countries throughout the world.
As you heard Minister Lavrov also say that the military drills are transparent, and Russia and China and South Africa have provided all the relevant information. I'm wondering how much of this has to do with the diplomatic stance that both South Africa and China have taken on the Ukraine war.
Well, you know, people keep on saying South Africa has no decision or no policy on the Ukraine-Russia war. But, you know, I go back to one academic who's defined a policy. He says a policy is what you decide to do or not to do. It's a policy. The fact that South Africa has taken a policy not to condemn Russia or to condemn the belligerent in the conflict, it's a policy stand. So there's no problem of a vacuum of policy. So people are really making a fuss out of this thing that South Africa ought to condemn. Remember, we are a sovereign state, and I think as a country, we're moving away from the old definition, Tsepiso, that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and the friend of my enemy is my enemy. We don't work like that. We look at the interests and international relations, actually. And I can say this with certainty as a student of diplomacy, that in international relations, we don't have permanent friends as states. We have interests, and we always look at our best interests. And that's how international politics is conducted, not only by us, by everyone around the world. They look into their interests and protect their own interests.
And we've seen a flurry of charm offensives from the West, diplomatic efforts to either, some might say, mollify, soften South Africa, or even what are perceived to be detractors' position on Russia. And as you say, it's also around the world order, the multilateral system. South Africa has been very clear that it's taken a non-aligned position, and it believes that the United Nations should be playing a constructive role in terms of conflict management and resolution on this particular issue. Why is South Africa denied agency to make its own diplomatic decisions?
You know, Tsepiso, when it comes to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, it's nothing new. There's a concept in international relations that we call a raison d'etat, or the Italian call it ragione di Stato, meaning that the state has to make decision for its own defense. And when it comes to that, the state would ignore any other treaties that exist for its own survival. It's a concept that exists, it's a behavior that exists. When the United States felt threatened at one stage by a small country like Grenada, they went to invade it and remove everyone. And no one actually is surprised by that. But the behavior of state is determined by how it assesses the threats to itself, and it acts accordingly. And that's where the question of sovereignty is. We are a sovereign state also as South Africa, and I think we should continue to exercise our rights to make friends with everyone in the West and in the East. I mean, the tension that is building sometimes is totally unnecessary. As we are having Minister Lavrov in the country, Secretary Yellen is also coming to the country to discuss certain things. She's in the region. But these are all countries looking into their interests. And as South Africa, we have to keep on identifying our interests. What we must not allow to happen in this country, Tshepiso, is the behavior of some companies that we've seen. I mean, it was so disturbing a few months ago that one read that one company at the airport refused to refuel a Russian plane because of sanction imposed by the US. That is wrong. We need to protect our own state and the sovereignty of our own state. The government must stand up and punish such companies because there are no sanctions that are imposed by this country. If we are against Russia, if we are going to allow companies that are operating in the country to impose sanctions against any other state, it's going to be chaos. It will be free for all in this country. In the United States, the American government have imposed sanctions on Russia and they expect American companies to behave accordingly. That's okay. But why would we allow companies here to impose sanctions? So they are starting to erode the function of our state, and our state must assert itself, because once that happens, a floodgate will be open, it will be a free-for-all.
And not to get bogged down in theory, but as you say, the whole concept of sovereignty, then there's national interests. There are those who say, you know, to even host Minister Lavrov is insensitive to the Ukraine community. But if you could just explain that, I mean, if we look at the way elections have gone, particularly in Europe, they've moved more to the right, and a lot of it driven by quote unquote nationalistic interests or parties. So what would you say to those who are saying South Africa is taking the wrong turn? And against the backdrop, as we mentioned, that we're hosting the BRICS summit later on, South Africa enjoys close ties with China and Russia. And that also goes back to the ANC as the governing party, the liberation struggle movement and the support that it achieved to end white minority rule.
So actually, the irony of what's happening in the international space now is that most parties that are to the center-right and the far-right, they're actually anti-war. If you look at the new government in Italy, they're very much anti what's going on there. In the United States, the House now is controlled by the Republican, which is the center-right party. They are really opposed to keep on pumping money and propelling the war. You're starting to see same sentiments even in Germany, in France, that people who are to the right of the political spectrum are so much opposed to the war. It's reconfiguring where the right used to stand and the left used to stand vis-a-vis the war. But all this are driven by interests. People are looking at how their interests are affected. So you'll be shocked now to learn that the debt, the global debt is $300 trillion US dollars from one report I have seen. $300 trillion US dollars. That's what we owe as individual, companies and the state. It's 340-something% of the global GDP. Now we are running a serious debt, and given the problems that are arising, that are really compounding the international space, people are starting to feel the pinch. And of course, people to the center-right of the political spectrum around the world are much more business-minded and focused on that. That's why they're starting to oppose the conflict. And I think as a country...
Yes, you can finish your train of thought. You can finish your train of thought, yes.
I think as a country, we need to reassert our own interests as a country, interact with everyone from the West and from the East. And that's going to best serve humanity.